Look up at the night sky long enough and the first lie it tells you is silence. A few stars, some darkness, a sense of open space so vast it almost cancels itself out. The mind accepts that picture immediately because it was built to. Human vision is local. Human intuition is parochial. It was trained on trees, weather, faces, falling rocks, not on structures so large that even light cannot cross them fast enough to keep reality current. So when you look up, you do not see the universe. You see what a creature like you is permitted to see. That distinction sounds small at first. It is not. It is the fracture everything else opens from. Because the blackness above you feels like absence. It feels like a shortage of things. It suggests that reality, however beautiful, is mostly empty space with a little matter scattered through it like dust in a dark room. But that picture collapses the moment you ask a more dangerous question. If the universe is truly populated on the scale modern astronomy now suggests, not with millions of galaxies, not with billions, but with at least trillions, then why does the sky not look crowded? Why does night not burn? Why is the cosmos, on its face, so visually poor? That question is older than modern cosmology, and sharper than it first appears, because once you ask it honestly, you're no longer just asking how much exists. You're asking whether perception has any right to be trusted at all. For centuries, the darkness of the night sky looked natural. It did not seem like a puzzle. It seemed like the baseline condition of the universe. Day was bright because the sun was near. Night was dark because the stars were far away. End of thought. But that answer only works if you refuse to push it. Because in a vast universe filled with stars in every direction, distance should not save darkness forever. More distant stars may look dimmer one by one, but there should also be more of them. Enough that, taken together, the whole sky ought to fill in. Every line of sight should eventually end on something luminous. Not a black void, but a surface of light. And yet it does not. The darkness is real. The conclusion is wrong. This is the first real humiliation in the story. The sky does not look empty because it is empty. It looks empty because emptiness is what limit feels like from the inside. That is a much harsher idea. Because now the problem is no longer out there. It is here, in the structure of observation itself. The reason the sky is dark is not that the universe lacks light. It is that reality has conditions. The universe has a finite age. Light from the most distant regions has not had infinite time to reach us. And while that light travels, space itself expands, stretching much of it out of the visible range. What begins as radiation fierce enough to flood a young cosmos can arrive here as something your eyes will never register. The darkness above you is not the opposite of abundance. It is abundance translated through distance, time, and biological inadequacy. Night is not what the universe looks like. Night is what the universe looks like after passing through us. And once that enters the frame, something deeper begins to fail. Because if even darkness is not straightforward, then our first intuition about scale is probably broken too. It was, for most of human history, the visible stars felt like the substance of the cosmos. They were the universe in practice. There were philosophical arguments, theological overlays, mathematical refinements, but emotionally and observationally, the picture was simple: a world below, a canopy above, and whatever deeper reality existed was imagined more than measured. Even after telescopes arrived, the expansion of knowledge did not happen all at once. Better lenses revealed more stars, richer textures, pale smears of light called nebulae. But seeing farther is not the same thing as understanding what you're seeing. A blur in a telescope can be a cloud, a gas shell, a cluster, or an entire galaxy viewed from a distance the mind has no language for yet. And for a long time, we had no such language. That is one of the strangest facts in this entire story. Humanity did not merely underestimate the size of the universe. Humanity misidentified the category of the thing it lived inside. The Milky Way was not just our galaxy. For a while, it was treated as the galaxy, the total stage, the whole known architecture of creation. Those spiral smudges seen in large telescopes, Andromeda, the whirlpool, others, were debated as objects inside our own system. Interesting, yes. Mysterious, yes. But not necessarily separate worlds of stars. Imagine the scale of that mistake. Imagine standing on one shoreline and thinking the ocean ends there. The universe did not first reveal its size through grandeur. It revealed it through embarrassment. Then came distance measurement. Real measurement. The kind that does not care what feels reasonable. In the early 20th century, astronomers began using Cepheid variable stars, stars whose changing brightness could be used as distance markers, to determine how far certain spiral nebulae actually were. Andromeda was not nearby. It was staggeringly far away. Too far to belong to the Milky Way, too far to be anything other than a separate system of stars. Another galaxy? 2 words and the wall breaks. Because once one external galaxy exists, the old universe is over. The cosmos is no longer one great stellar city with decorative fog around it. It becomes a field of cities, then a depth of them, then a population so large that the human mind begins switching from comprehension to ritual repetition. Millions, billions, hundreds of billions, trillions. At that point, numbers stop behaving like knowledge. They become evidence of mismatch. And still, even there, intuition tries to defend itself. It tries to turn the galaxies into a large collection of visible objects, as if the universe was simply the night sky with more resolution, more points, more detail. But that is not what happened. What happened was stranger and less comforting. Because the more we measured those galaxies, the more they refused to remain fixed. Their light was shifted toward the red. The farther away the galaxy, the stronger the shift. At first this seems technical, even dry. It is not. It means that space is not a passive stage where matter drifts around like actors on a floor. The floor itself is stretching. The distance between large cosmic structures grows because the geometry they inhabit is evolving. This is where the story stops being a census and becomes a rupture in common sense. Galaxies are not simply out there waiting to be counted. They are out there inside a universe whose very scale changes while their light is on its way to us. So when you look deep into space, you're not looking across a stable map. You're looking through a moving medium at sources whose messages are ancient by the time they arrive. Astronomy is not the study of what is happening. It is the study of what managed to survive the journey. That changes the meaning of every image we have ever taken of the cosmos. A star is not present to you. A galaxy is not present to you. Even the nearest large structures are offered under delay. The farther you look, the older the information becomes. Push far enough, and observation turns into excavation. You're no longer seeing distant objects as they are. You're seeing younger versions of reality, preserved in transit, arriving now because now is how long it took. Distance is also time, and time, on these scales, is not a backdrop. It is damage, it is redshift, it is fading, it is loss. It is the reason a universe crowded with structure can still appear sparse to a species standing on one planet, under one atmosphere with one narrow band of vision. Which leads to the harder realization waiting beneath the galaxy count. The question is not simply how many galaxies exist. The question is what kind of universe would allow almost all of them to remain, in practice, invisible. Because once that becomes the real question, the black sky above you changes character. It is no longer a calm backdrop. It is no longer the natural face of reality. It is a filter, a severe one, a censored surface produced by finite time, expanding space, redshifted light, instrumental limits, and the tiny sensory budget of a local animal mind. The universe does not look empty because it is empty. It looks empty because your access to reality is thin. And that is only the beginning of the wound. Because thin is the right word. Not wrong, not useless, just disastrously narrow. Human beings evolved inside a world where the things that mattered announced themselves at manageable scales. A storm can be seen. A predator can be heard. A falling branch obeys a speed the body can anticipate. Even when nature becomes overwhelming, it usually remains continuous with instinct. You may not survive it, but you can at least feel the category of threat. The cosmos offers no such mercy. Its deepest truths do not arrive in native human form. They arrive translated into dimness, delay, statistical inference, distorted wavelengths, faint gradients on detectors cooled almost to absolute zero. Reality, at cosmic scale, does not present itself. It has to be extracted. And extraction is not the same as seeing That is why even the phrase "the observable universe" contains more violence than it seems to. It sounds like a label for everything we can look at, as though the matter were basically solved. Here is the universe, and here is the part we happen to observe. But the phrase is much more severe than that. It marks a boundary not in space alone, but in causality. It names the region from which information has had time to reach us since the beginning of cosmic expansion. Nothing outside that horizon is certified absent. It is merely unavailable. That distinction will matter more than almost anything else in this story. Because the horizon is not a wall you could fly toward and eventually touch. It is not the edge of a map. It is not a shell of matter. It is the moving consequence of finite age, finite signal speed, and a universe that has been expanding the entire time the signal travelled. A limit made not of stone, but of history. This is where common sense finally runs out of road. If the universe is about 13.8 billion years old, intuition wants the visible boundary to be about 13.8 billion light years away. That feels neat. Light travels 1 light year per year. Let it run for 13.8 billion years, and there you are. But the universe did not hold still while that light crossed it. Space expanded. Distances stretched. The source that emitted the light and the place where we now receive it was separated by a geometry that kept changing during the journey. So the most distant matter we can observe today is not sitting 13.8 billion light-years away in present terms. The present-day moving radius of the observable universe is on the order of 46 billion light-years. A number like that should cause a kind of quiet panic. Not because it is large. Large numbers by themselves are cheap. But because it means reality has stopped honouring the mental rules that once felt foundational. Distance is no longer just distance. It is distance embedded in expansion, measured through an evolving background, recovered from ancient light whose journey took place in a universe that was smaller than the one we now inhabit. The ruler bent while the measurement was being made. And if the ruler can bend, then scale itself becomes unstable in the hands. This is one of the reasons astronomy feels so unlike ordinary experience. In daily life, seeing is close to knowing. On cosmic scales, seeing is an encounter with what remains after transit. The object you measure is entangled with the path by which its information arrives. Its light has aged. Its wavelengths have stretched. Its brightness has thinned. By the time it enters the telescope, it is not simply the object speaking. It is the object plus the universe plus the cost of crossing. Every photon has a biography. That is not poetry. It is a measurement problem. And once you understand that, the night sky starts to look less like a view and more like a residue. Not a direct portrait of cosmic reality, but a surviving sample after severe filtering. This star was close enough. That galaxy was bright enough. This wavelength stayed inside instrumental reach. That signal escaped absorption, dilution, and time. Everything else fell below the threshold. The blackness between stars is not the neutral background of being. It is what remains when most of reality fails the conditions for appearance. Which is why one of the most damaging words in astronomy is empty. We use it too casually. Empty region, empty patch of sky, empty intergalactic space. But at cosmological scales, emptiness is usually just a confession of insufficient interaction. The region may be dark in visible light and still hold diffuse gas, dark matter, relic radiation, faint dwarf galaxies, ancient streams of stars, or entire populations of objects too dim for the instruments that first surveyed them. What appears barren is often only weakly legible. The universe rarely gives us true nothing. It gives us thresholds. And thresholds create illusions that feel like facts. For a long time, the sparse appearance of the sky encouraged exactly that mistake. Even after other galaxies were accepted, there was still a temptation to imagine them as relatively rare jewels embedded in an otherwise mostly vacant cosmos. Immense, yes, but cleanly structured. A galaxy here, another there, huge distances in between. The mind can at least pretend to hold that image. But the more seriously astronomers tried to count what was out there, the more unstable even that compromise became. Because counting galaxies is not like counting stones on a beach. You do not stand outside the system with clean visibility. You count from inside a moving, aging, light-limited universe using instruments with finite sensitivity. Bright galaxies are easier. Nearby galaxies are easier. Large galaxies are easier. Galaxies whose light remains in accessible wavelengths are easier. Everything that is small, faint, distant, diffuse, or shifted too far into the infrared begins to slip away. So every census begins biased. And bias at cosmic scale does not produce a small accounting error. It produces an ontology problem. It changes what kind of universe you think you're living in. If your telescope mostly catches large, luminous galaxies, then the cosmos looks relatively sparse and architecturally mature. It looks like reality comes pre-assembled in giant forms. If your instruments become deeper, colder, sharper, more patient, then suddenly the same universe starts revealing smaller systems, dimmer systems, earlier systems, structures that were always there but did not count as real to you because they never entered the visible sample. That is the hidden brutality of observational science. Existence and detectability are not the same thing, but history keeps pressuring us to confuse them. A thing we cannot yet detect is not therefore speculative in the childish sense. Sometimes it's the most statistically unavoidable part of the picture. That is exactly what began to happen with galaxies. The old popular image, hundreds of billions of galaxies in the observable universe, sounded absurdly large, and for a while it was treated almost like a final answer. The number itself was so beyond intuition that it felt terminal. What possible psychological difference could there be between hundreds of billions and something even larger? Surely at that point the mind has already surrendered. But psychologically, yes. Physically, no. Because the old accounts were shaped by what telescopes could actually resolve, and by how astronomers extrapolated from the visible populations. They were not pure inventory. They were reconstructions built under visibility constraints. And as the data improved, one uncomfortable pattern kept returning. The deeper we looked, the more crowded the universe became, not with bright grand spirals alone, but with countless smaller, fainter galaxies that the earlier picture had largely failed to include. Not because anyone was careless, because reality was dimmer than our confidence. That difference matters. It matters because it changes the emotional logic of the cosmos. The universe did not merely turn out to be larger than expected. It turned out to be harder to make visible than expected, which is more disturbing, because size can still be admired. Invisibility attacks the terms of contact themselves. It suggests that reality may be densely structured and still arrive to us as poverty. And once that possibility opens, a patch of black sky is no longer innocent. It becomes suspicious. Not because we have found something exotic there, because we have learned to stop trusting the word nothing. The real turn comes when astronomers aim at what looks like almost nothing at all. Not a bright nebula, not a famous galaxy, not some obvious spectacle, but a tiny, dark patch of sky so apparently uneventful that no ordinary eye would linger on it. A place chosen almost as an insult to expectation. And what comes back does not just deepen the story, it changes the meaning of emptiness forever. That choice was almost perverse. Take a telescope powerful enough to transform astronomy. Point it not at a famous object, not at a bright galaxy, not at a region already known to be rich with spectacle, but at what looked like a nearly blank patch of sky. Hold the stare. Keep holding it. Let the instrument collect photons so faint and so delayed that ordinary seeing would have thrown them away as nothing. Then wait to find out whether nothing was ever there. In 1995, the Hubble Space Telescope did exactly that. The target was a tiny region in Ursa Major so small that, held at arm's length, it would cover less area than a grain of sand. Not a grand slice of heaven. A speck. A deliberate insult to human expectation. What came back was not empty. It was crowded almost beyond dignity. The Hubble Deep Field revealed thousands of galaxies where visible intuition had offered almost none. Spirals, ellipticals, irregular smears, collisions in progress, fragments of structure caught in older states. A tiny wound in the black sky suddenly opened into a depth so saturated with distant systems that the old emotional grammar of mostly empty space began to collapse under its own laziness. The shock was not just the number, it was the indictment. Because the deep field did not create those galaxies. It exposed how much reality had been excluded by shallow vision. The emptiness was not there. Our blindness was. That distinction is the real violence in astronomy. We often speak as though better instruments extend knowledge outward from a basically reliable core, the way a brighter flashlight helps you inspect a room you were already standing in. But that is too gentle. Sometimes better instruments do not merely add detail. They overturn the felt architecture of the whole situation. They reveal that the room was never a room. It was a narrow beam moving through a cathedral. And Hubble did it again. The first deep field was followed by deeper ones. The Hubble Ultra Deep Field. Then the Extreme Deep Field. Integrations built from even longer exposures and more carefully combined data. Each time, a patch of apparent darkness was pressured until it surrendered more structure. More galaxies. More faint light from earlier times. More evidence that the black sky was not a clean background waiting behind luminous objects, but a visual compression produced by distance, dimness, and finite collection time. Darkness kept failing stress tests. That is one of the most revealing patterns in modern cosmology. Whenever observation becomes patient enough, empty regions begin to populate themselves, not infinitely, not magically, but lawfully, relentlessly, enough to force a change in temperament. The universe did not need to become weirder than physics. It only needed to become less available to instinct. And the deep fields carried another humiliation inside them. They were still incomplete. This is easy to miss because the images themselves are so overwhelming. Once you see a single tiny patch of sky blooming with galaxies, it is tempting to treat the emotional work as done. The cosmos is more crowded than we thought. Message received. But even there, in those famous images, we are still seeing only what crossed the threshold, only what was bright enough, large enough, and favourably placed enough for those exposures and detectors to recover. The deep fields did not end the invisibility problem. They sharpened it. Because once you discover that a nearly blank patch contains thousands of galaxies, the next question is no longer whether the universe is crowded. The next question is how many galaxies even those images are still missing. That is a much more dangerous question, because it forces astronomy out of the comfort zone of direct seeing and into the harsher terrain of inference. It is one thing to admire what a telescope reveals. It is another to accept that the most important conclusion may concern what the telescope still cannot reveal. At that point, the act of counting becomes strangely philosophical. What do you mean by how many galaxies are there? Do you mean how many galaxies have been directly imaged? How many are bright enough for current surveys? How many once existed at earlier cosmic times before later mergers changed the population? How many lie inside the observable universe right now, whether or not we can isolate them individually? How many faint dwarfs blur below the limits of resolution, their collective presence easier to infer statistically than to see one by one? The question sounds numerical, but its difficulty is ontological. You're not just counting things. You're deciding what kind of absence counts as evidence. This is where older galaxy estimates begin to look less like final answers and more like temporary treaties with limited data. For years, the familiar public number hovered around 100 billion galaxies, later often widened to something like 200 billion. Even that sounded intolerably large. It had the right psychological effect, enough to crush provincial imagination, enough to make Earth feel microscopic, enough to satisfy the appetite for cosmic grandeur. Popularly, it functioned as a terminal number. Once you say hundreds of billions, most minds stop demanding revision. But science does not care when the mind gets tired. Those estimates were based on the galaxies astronomers could observe and the ways they extrapolated from those samples. Reasonable methods, serious work, but every method inherits the biases of what it can reach. Bright objects enter first. Nearby objects enter first. Massive systems dominate detection. A census built under those conditions will not merely miss a few obscure outliers. It will tend to underrepresent the small and faint populations that could be numerous enough to change the character of the whole count. And in the universe, small things are rarely negligible for long, especially in the past, because the modern cosmos did not begin as a neatly arranged collection of giant galaxies hanging in mature isolation. The large spirals and ellipticals we find familiar now are, in many cases, products of assembly. Earlier epochs were messier, denser, more violent with mergers, more crowded with smaller proto-galactic systems and dwarf-scale structures that later combined, accreted, or were torn apart. If you only count the bright, finished architecture of the late universe. You are counting after the consolidation has already happened. You are surveying the ruins after compression and calling them the original city plan. That matters because it changes the direction of intuition. We naturally imagine the past as emptier, fewer things, simpler things, less built-up reality. But in one important sense, the opposite is true. The early universe may have contained far more separate small galaxies than the present universe contains distinct large ones, precisely because time merges complexity upward. Cosmic structure does not only grow by adding, it also grows by combining. The universe becomes smoother by consuming its own granularity. That sentence sounds abstract until you translate it physically. Imagine a world not of a few continents, but of innumerable islands, shoals, fragments, drifting pieces colliding and binding into larger landmasses over immense spans. The later map looks cleaner. The earlier map was more crowded, not because it was more advanced, but because it had not yet spent its chaos. So if your telescopes struggle most with small faint galaxies, and they do, then the place your census is most likely to fail is exactly where the population may once have been richest. This is why the deep fields mattered so much. They were not only beautiful images, they were warnings. Warnings that visibility and reality were diverging more severely than earlier astronomy had emotionally absorbed. Each deeper exposure suggested that the cosmos was not merely large in the obvious way, it was populous in a way that punished shallow sampling. And once that suspicion hardens, the old numbers start to look fragile. Not false in the cheap sense, not embarrassing, just provisional in a universe that had already shown how much it could hide in plain darkness. By then, the real question was no longer whether the observable universe held many galaxies. It was whether we had mistaken a bright minority for almost the whole. And that is exactly the kind of mistake the universe is built to encourage. Because brightness feels authoritative. A large, luminous galaxy announces itself with the confidence of something that seems representative. It occupies the image, it survives short exposures, it persists across survey methods. It gives the impression that reality, at least at cosmic scale, is organized around the things easiest to see. A giant spiral with clean arms, a bright elliptical burning with old stars, a dramatic collision frozen in light. These look like the main actors. Everything smaller begins to feel secondary, decorative, peripheral. But observational bias always flatters the obvious. The cosmos is under no obligation to make the obvious fundamental. That lesson had to be learned slowly, because astronomy is trapped inside a brutal asymmetry. The more abundant something is, the easier it might be to miss if each individual member is faint enough. A few giant bonfires are simpler to detect than a continent full of candles seen through fog. If you build your picture from what arrives most clearly, you can end up with a universe dominated by exceptions. This is why the deep fields did not merely add galaxies to account. They exposed the logic by which entire populations disappear. A distant galaxy does not simply get dimmer with distance in the ordinary, intuitive way. Its light spreads, its apparent surface brightness drops, its wavelengths stretch as space expands. Features that would be obvious nearby become fragile at great range. A small galaxy in the early universe can be intrinsically significant and still fall beneath the threshold of detection so completely that, for practical purposes, it never enters the visible census at all. Not because it is unreal, because the universe taxes visibility. Once you grasp that, the old counts begin to look almost optimistic in the wrong direction. They assumed, reasonably enough, that what could be sampled and extrapolated gave a fair picture of the total, but if the faint end population was vastly richer than the visible sample implied, then the census was never just incomplete. It was tilted toward what the instruments were biologically easiest to trust: the large, the bright, the resolved, the photogenic. Reality is rarely distributed according to photogenicity. And this is where the number changes from impressive to destabilizing. In 2016, a team led by Christopher Consolis used data from deep surveys and galaxy evolution models to argue that the observable universe may contain at least around 2 trillion galaxies, roughly 10 times the older common estimate. The headline was enormous, but the deeper point was even more severe. The majority of galaxies were likely too faint and too distant to be seen directly with the instruments then available. The universe was not merely more crowded than expected. It was crowded specifically in the region where our eyes, even mechanized eyes, had been failing. That changes the emotional texture of the whole subject. Because a number like 2 trillion is not just more, it is a verdict on method. It says that for all the grandeur of modern telescopes, for all the breathtaking images and maps and catalogues, the visible sample may still have represented only a minority of what was really there, a bright skin over a hidden depth. The real shock is not the number. It is how much of reality had to be inferred because reality would not present itself cleanly to sight. And the inference was not arbitrary. It emerged from a pattern. When astronomers looked back to earlier cosmic times, they found evidence that galaxies were smaller, more numerous, and more densely packed into the sensors of the young universe than the later, more consolidated cosmos around us. Over billions of years, many of those smaller systems merged into larger galaxies. Distinct structures became components. Separate islands became continents. The visible population thinned not because reality became poorer, but because its granularity was spent. That is one of the most counterintuitive facts in the whole script. The universe we live in now may look richer because it contains giant galaxies and mature structure. But in terms of separate galactic bodies, the past may have been more crowded, more fragmented, more numerically dense. The modern cosmos is, in one sense, a cleaned-up aftermath. The later universe is smoother because the violence has already happened. You can feel the wrong intuition trying to fight that sentence. Bigger should mean more. Mature should mean fuller. Older should mean accumulated abundance. But the universe does not grow the way cities grow. It does not simply stack more independent units on top of what came before. It assembles by collision, accretion, cannibalism. Large galaxies are often archives of consumed smaller ones. To count only the survivors at the end is to underestimate how crowded the earlier map may have been. A forest after fire can look simpler than the chaos that fed it. And so the story changes shape again. At first, it was about the darkness of the sky. Then it became about the discovery of other galaxies. Then it became about the expanding universe and the horizon of observable reality. Now it turns into something harsher. The universe is not only larger than it appears, it is less directly accessible than the very idea of appearance prepares us for. Whole populations of galaxies may sit below the line where light becomes usefully collectible, not absent, not mystical, just statistically implied, physically motivated, and observationally elusive. This is the point where counting galaxies stops sounding like a triumph and starts sounding like a confession. We do not possess the cosmos by imaging it. We surround it with methods and infer what the visible fraction is trying to say. That distinction matters because it prevents the number from becoming cheap spectacle. 2 trillion galaxies can easily be consumed as another premium cosmic fact, another oversized statistic to decorate the imagination for a few seconds, before the mind goes numb and moves on. But the truthful version is less comfortable and much more interesting. 2 trillion means the universe overran our first serious census. 2 trillion means darkness was hiding not a few leftovers, but entire classes of things. 2 trillion means that what felt like a near-total picture may have been a bright minority mistaken for reality itself. And even that statement has to be handled with care, because honest science becomes more rigorous precisely where language wants to become absolute. The estimate is model-based. The exact number is not a sacred digit carved into the universe. It depends on how galaxy populations are inferred across time, on assumptions about faint-end distributions, on what counts as a distinct galaxy in different epochs of assembly. The point is not fetishizing the numeral. The point is the direction of the correction. It is the fact that better reasoning forced the count upward by an amount large enough to expose just how visibility limited our earlier confidence had been. That is what makes the result philosophically dangerous. Because once a revision is that large, the subject is no longer only galaxies. The subject becomes the structural unreliability of intuitive access to reality. We are used to being corrected at the margins, a little more, a little less, a smaller uncertainty bar. But when a mature scientific culture revises a cosmic population by an order of magnitude, it leaves behind a wound in ordinary confidence, not a wound in science. Science is doing exactly what it should, but a wound in the fantasy that reality was ever obligated to be legible at first pass. The universe does not become more truthful when we look deeper. It becomes less forgiving. And that is the midpoint of the descent, though you would not feel it as a midpoint while living through it. you would feel it as a shift in category. The video is no longer really about a giant number. It is about why the number had to be hidden in the first place. Because what telescopes reveal, if you stay with them long enough, is not merely that the cosmos is immense. It is that reality becomes harder to see precisely where it becomes most populous. That sounds almost malicious, as if nature were designing itself against observers. But the truth is colder than that. There is no malice here, only law. Light weakens, wavelengths stretch, surface brightness falls, time imposes delay, instruments inherit thresholds, minds mistake thresholds for boundaries. And all of it conspires to create the same illusion, that the visible sample is the world. It is not. It never was. The galaxies in those deep images, staggering as they are, represent a victory, but they also represent a warning. Because if that much structure can hide inside what once looked like nothing, then the next question is no longer how many galaxies we have found. It is what kind of a universe produces abundance by becoming less and less visible the more honestly you try to measure it. Because abundance is only the first layer of the insult. The deeper one is that abundance does not arrive in a form the mind can keep. Once you accept that much of the universe is hidden not by mystery but by lawful limitation, another intuition starts to fail. We like to imagine that better instruments simply peel back darkness in a clean, cumulative way. First one layer, then another, until reality eventually yields its full design. A patient unveiling, a steady approach to completion. But the universe does not open like that. Each improvement in vision solves one problem by revealing a worse one underneath. Detect a faint galaxy, and you discover a still fainter population beyond it. Extend observation into the infrared, and the early universe begins crowding with objects whose existence forces harder questions about formation. Increase sensitivity, and the scene does not become final. It becomes unstable again. Knowledge does not calm the cosmos. It increases the number of ways it can refuse to fit inside intuition. This is what makes observational astronomy feel almost tragic at its highest level. Every gain is real. Every new image is a genuine victory. And yet each victory also sharpens the outline of what remains inaccessible. Not because science is failing, but because success keeps clarifying the scale of the distance between appearance and structure. You can feel this most clearly in the fate of light itself. We talk about light as though it were the ideal messenger, clean, constant, truthful. And in one sense it is. It obeys laws, it carries information, it lets a universe separated by impossible distances remain, at least partially, knowable. But light also arrives exhausted. A photon emitted in the deep past does not cross a static emptiness like a letter sliding across a table. It travels through an expanding cosmos. Its wavelength stretches, its energy thins, its source grows more remote even as its message comes closer. By the time that signal reaches us, it is not simply ancient. It has been altered by the geometry of the universe that carried it. The message survives. The original conditions do not. That is why so much of cosmology is reconstruction rather than witness. We are not standing outside the universe taking inventory in broad daylight. We are inside it, late, working from weakened traces, ancient light, background radiation, redshifts, spectra, statistical distributions, tiny differences in brightness and colour from which entire histories must be recovered. To do that responsibly requires an almost unnatural discipline, because the temptation is always to slide back into the visual metaphor, to think that because we have an image, we have the thing. But an astronomical image is not the same kind of object as ordinary seeing. It is often processed, stacked, filtered, exposure corrected, wavelength translated, not because it is dishonest, but because reality at those scales does not arrive ready-made for human senses. The universe has to be rendered before it becomes legible. That is a devastating sentence if you let it sit for a moment. It means the cosmos, as experienced by the human nervous system, is already a reduced version of itself, first by biology, then by atmosphere, then by instrumental thresholds, then by time delay, then by the mathematics required to reconstruct what the delayed signal could have meant at the source. What we call a view of the universe is often the end product of a long negotiation with invisibility. And once that is true, the galaxy count stops being merely large and starts becoming diagnostic. It tells you something about the behavior of reality under pressure from observation. A sparse visible sky, a crowded hidden universe, a tiny observable sample, a much richer inferred population. These are not separate curiosities. They are all versions of the same statement. What exists and what appears are related, but they are not the same category. That sentence is easy to say and almost impossible to emotionally absorb, because daily life trains us in the opposite direction. Here on Earth, appearance usually has practical authority. A wall is where it looks like it is. A road continues where it seems to continue. A person stands in front of you if you can see them standing there. There are exceptions, illusions, distortions, but at survival scale, the visible world is good enough to function as reality. Cosmology is what happens when good enough finally breaks. At these scales, the visible world is not false, but it is stripped down so aggressively that it can no longer be trusted as a faithful summary. Darkness no longer means emptiness. Distance no longer means what it seems to mean. A count no longer means only what has been directly seen. Even the phrase now begins to lose its force, because the farther you look, the older everything becomes. The sky above you is full of temporal disagreement. Some of those stars may no longer exist in the form you see. Some galaxies are shown to you in an earlier condition than the one they inhabit now. Even nearby cosmic truth arrives belated. The universe never presents itself in one tense. That alone should be enough to unsettle the old fantasy that reality is a stable scene laid out for inspection. It is not a scene. It is an arriving remainder. And this is where the story begins to move from sheer scale into something more severe. The possibility that our best contact with the universe is always mediated by loss, not just distance, but transformed distance, not just information, but information after dilution, not just observation, but observation after the world has already imposed its conditions on what can be observed. Which means that the deeper we look, the less the universe resembles a landscape and the more it resembles a problem in recovery. That does not make it less beautiful. It makes the beauty colder. Because now the grandeur does not come only from how much exists, it comes from the way law itself governs access. There is no conspiracy here, no cosmic malice, no theatrical hiding, only structure, expansion, redshift, faintness, horizon, threshold. The universe is not keeping secrets in the human sense. It is simply built in a way that does not privilege being seen. That may be the most difficult thing for intuition to accept. We still carry, somewhere deep in our inherited imagination, the ancient assumption that reality and revelation belong together, that what is deepest will in some way declare itself, that enough patience will turn hiddenness into display. But the cosmos gives us a harsher arrangement. Some things can be revealed only indirectly. Some things can be inferred more clearly than they can be imaged. Some things remain physically real while observationally unreachable. And some of the most important truths arrive not as spectacle, but as a forced correction to what spectacle allowed us to believe. The black sky is one of those corrections. The deep fields were another. The trillions estimate was another. And once those corrections accumulate, the next frontier stops looking like a simple extension of vision. It starts to look like a confrontation with the earliest universe itself, with the first galaxies, the first large structures, the first times matter began organizing itself into forms dense enough to leave a lasting imprint on cosmic history. That is where the pressure sharpens again. Because if the universe was already crowded with hidden galaxies across later time, then what happened near the beginning, in those first brutal stretches after darkness gave way to stars, becomes more than a historical curiosity. It becomes the place where our models have to face the speed at which reality began building itself. And that speed is where the story becomes dangerous again. For a long time, the early universe lived in the imagination as a kind of graceful scarcity. A hot beginning, yes. A violent beginning, yes. But also a simple one. Matter cooling, hydrogen and helium filling space, gravity slowly gathering what it could, stars igniting, galaxies taking shape over vast spans, structure arriving patiently, almost ceremonially, out of an initially smoother state. That picture was never childish. It came from serious physics. The early universe really was hotter, denser, and more uniform than the cosmos we inhabit now. Tiny fluctuations in matter density, seeded in the primordial plasma, grew under gravity into the large-scale structure we see today. Cold dark matter helped provide the scaffolding. Gas fell into halos, stars formed, galaxies assembled. This broad framework remains one of the great achievements of modern cosmology. But frameworks are not endings. They are promises about what details should look like when your instruments finally get there. And that is where things start to tighten. Because the first galaxies are not just early versions of familiar objects. They are tests of tempo, tests of how quickly matter could cool, cluster, ignite, enrich itself with heavier elements, and build luminous systems under the brutal conditions of a young universe. Every detection in that era is not just a sighting, it is a timing constraint, a statement about how fast reality can become organized after beginning in near simplicity. That is why the earliest galaxies matter so much. Not because ancient objects are automatically more poetic, but because the opening stages of structure formation are where theory loses the comfort of hindsight. In the nearby universe, there has been time for mergers, accretion, recycling, feedback, collapse, and long evolutionary smoothing. By contrast, the first billion years are raw. The machinery is still exposed, gravity is working with less time, gas clouds are less enriched. The interval between primordial simplicity and visible architecture is brutally short. If large or bright galaxies appear too early, the question is immediate and merciless. How did structure build that fast? That tension existed before the newest generation of telescopes. Hubble had already pushed deep enough to reveal galaxies from surprisingly early epochs. Astronomers knew that substantial structure emerged remarkably quickly on cosmic timescales, but there were still limits, hard ones. Hubble was extraordinary, yet it was not designed to live natively in the infrared regime where the most ancient starlight, stretched by expansion, becomes easier to recover. The first chapters of the universe were there, but still partly behind frosted glass. Then a new eye opened. The James Webb Space Telescope was built for exactly this problem. Its mirror was larger, its detectors were tuned for infrared light. It was designed to look into the epochs where cosmic dawn and the earliest generations of galaxies begin to separate themselves from theory and become data. And when Webb began sending back images, one thing became immediately clear. The early universe was not going to be emotionally simple. It was not a blank preface. It was not a slow warm-up. It was already busy with light, already populated with galaxies, already showing structure where intuition still wanted a quieter beginning. Programs like JADES began finding galaxies at redshifts corresponding to astonishingly early times, within a few 100 million years after the Big Bang. Not theoretical placeholders, real candidates with shapes, luminosities, and inferred properties that forced astronomers to sharpen their estimates of how quickly the first systems grew. That is where the public story became louder than the science. You may remember the headlines, galaxies appearing too early, cosmology in crisis, the universe breaking our models. It was exactly the kind of language modern media prefers: simple, dramatic, terminal. Reality, as usual, was better and more difficult. Some of the earliest Webb detections did look unexpectedly bright and massive if interpreted in the most straightforward initial way. That was a genuine tension worth taking seriously. But astronomy at the edge of the observable universe is not a game of first impressions. At those distances, a galaxy's light has travelled for over 13 billion years, been stretched by cosmic expansion, filtered through the limits of instruments, and then interpreted through models that translate brightness and colour into estimates of age, star formation rate, and stellar mass. That means the first answer is often provisional by design. A source that looks like a startlingly massive early galaxy may, under better scrutiny, turn out to include light from an actively feeding black hole, or its redshift may need spectroscopic confirmation, or its stellar mass may have been overestimated because the models used to interpret the photometry were working with incomplete assumptions about the source. None of this makes the early excitement foolish. It makes it scientific. The corrected picture is not smaller. It is sharper. And what emerged from that sharpening is more interesting than the first round of sensationalism. Webb did not simply announce that cosmology was broken. It revealed that the early universe was already building luminous structure very rapidly, and that our previous direct view of those epochs had been far poorer than we appreciated. Some of the most extreme claims were softened as the data improved, but the underlying message remained severe. The first few 100 million years were not an empty waiting room before the universe became architecturally serious. Construction began early. Very early. You can feel why that matters, because the modern universe is spacious in a way that seduces the mind into thinking time and order are generous. Galaxies sit far apart. Mature spirals rotate with almost arrogant stability. Ellipticals glow with old, settled populations of stars. Clusters hang together like finished institutions. Everything about the nearby cosmos suggests that time has been plentiful. But go back far enough and that comfort evaporates. In the first several 100 million years, the universe is still emerging from darkness. The cosmic microwave background has long since decoupled. Yes, but the age of widespread starlight is young. Gas is falling into dark matter halos. The first generations of stars are igniting, dying, enriching surrounding matter with heavier elements. Ultraviolet radiation from young stars and black holes is beginning to ionize neutral hydrogen across intergalactic space. The medium itself is changing character. Visibility is changing with it. Light is not just traveling through the universe, it is helping transform it. This is not a calm beginning. It is a beginning under compression. That phrase matters because it translates the science into something the body can almost feel. The early universe is not merely young in the sentimental sense. It is a place where everything that will later look spacious, settled, and mature is being forced into existence on terrifyingly short timescales. Gravity does not get to work with leisure. Star formation does not get to unfold against a quiet background. Feedback from supernovae, black holes, radiation, and gas dynamics begins almost immediately. Every early galaxy is a negotiated truce between collapse and disruption. A structure forming there is not just old, it is fast. And speed is what makes Webb's early results so gripping. Not because they license fake apocalyptic claims about cosmology collapsing overnight, but because they return us to the deepest tension in the whole video. Human intuition consistently underestimates how strange lawful reality can be when scale, time, and visibility are all pushed to their limits. The night sky looked empty because we were seeing a filtered fraction. Deep fields revealed hidden crowding because patience defeated a shallow impression. The 2 trillion estimate showed that entire populations of galaxies could sit below direct detection. And now the early universe adds another correction, even near the beginning. Reality may have begun assembling visible structure faster than our untutored imagination finds psychologically comfortable. Not magic, not broken physics, just a universe that keeps choosing lawful answers which feel, from the human side, almost indecently severe. That is why the frontier has changed shape again. The question is no longer only how many galaxies there are, or even how many of them remain unseen. It is how rapidly the universe crossed the threshold from hot simplicity into visible complexity, how quickly darkness gave way not just to light, but to organized light, to galaxies, to systems, to architecture. And the more honestly we try to answer that, the less the early cosmos resembles a blank beginning, and the more it resembles a construction site already roaring before intuition thought the tools had even arrived. And the worst part is that speed does not just challenge expectation, it destabilizes narrative, because human beings are addicted to gradualism when they imagine creation. We like beginnings that behave with decorum, a slow accumulation, a little more structure each age, order arriving in proportion to time, as though the universe itself respects the pacing instincts of a storyteller. But the cosmos has no literary manners. Give gravity a slight overdensity in a dark matter halo, give gas a place to fall, give the first stars a chance to ignite, and the entire scene can accelerate with a brutality that makes early feel like the wrong word. What matters is not that the universe was young. What matters is how quickly youth became structured. That is the real discomfort hidden inside the first galaxies. Because once visible architecture appears that soon after the beginning, you are forced to stop thinking in broad ceremonial terms and start thinking mechanistically. How efficient was cooling? How rapidly did gas collapse? How quickly did the first generations of stars enrich their environments? How strongly did stellar winds and supernova feedback regulate further formation? How much did black holes contribute to the observed brightness of early sources? How did reionization change what could be seen, and when? At this depth, Wonder becomes inseparable from process. And that is exactly where premium science storytelling either becomes real or starts cheating. It is easy to say the early universe was mysterious. It is easy to inflate uncertainty into theatrical fog. But the truth is better than that because it is sharper. The early universe is gripping not because it is vague, but because its laws are specific. Every surprising galaxy in that era is not a vague omen. It is a pressure point on a chain of mechanisms. A bright object at high redshift is a question asked in the language of efficiency. How fast could matter organize itself into light? That question sounds technical until you translate what it means physically. A galaxy seen from that far away is not some polished grand spiral drifting peacefully in a finished cosmos. It is light emerging from a universe still close to its own beginning, when matter was denser, interactions rougher, and the intervals available for assembly brutally compressed. You are watching architecture appear while the construction materials are still arriving. It should feel unstable, and yet the instability does not produce chaos in the childish sense. It produces order under pressure. Stars ignite, radiation pours out, gas cools, collapses, is heated, is expelled, falls back again. Dark matter halos provide invisible scaffolding. Small systems merge. Some are shredded, some survive. Some feed black holes whose glare can masquerade as stellar mass if you're not careful. The first visible universe is not a clean unveiling. It is a negotiation between building and disruption. That is why early web results had to be handled with such care. Not because caution is boring, but because the edge of observation punishes simplicity. When an object appears astonishingly bright at extreme distance, there are multiple ways to be wrong before you are right. Its distance might be misestimated without spectroscopic confirmation. Its light might include a significant active galactic nucleus rather than only stars. Its stellar population models may be interpreted too quickly. The first impression may be dramatic. The deeper answer may be less loud and more real. Science earns its authority by surviving that correction. And the correction, here, did not erase the strangeness. It refined it. That is important enough to say cleanly. The most responsible reading of Webb's early universe discoveries is not that cosmology shattered. It is that the young universe appears to have built luminous structure rapidly enough to keep the frontier genuinely tense. While some of the most extreme early mass claims have become more moderate as spectroscopy and better modelling improved the picture, the first picture was louder. The corrected picture is deeper. Because now the tension is no longer cheap. It is not everything we knew was wrong. It is something more adult, which is almost always more unsettling. Our leading framework still works remarkably well, and the universe still found ways to make the opening stages of structure formation feel faster, denser, and less psychologically gentle than intuition expected. That kind of truth lingers longer because it is not a slogan. It is a wound in tempo. We thought beginnings would look emptier. Instead, even the dawn seems crowded. And that matters for a reason larger than the early universe itself. It matters because it completes a pattern that has been tightening since the opening line of this script. First, the black sky turned out not to mean emptiness. Then deep fields turned apparent nothing into swarms of galaxies. Then the census jumped upward because faint populations had been underestimated. Now the first billion years refuse to behave like a sparse prelude. Each correction moves in the same direction. Reality keeps becoming less visually obvious and more structurally full. That is the true thesis beginning to show itself in full weight. On the surface, this story is about galaxy counts. Underneath, it is about the repeated humiliation of intuition. We keep expecting reality to distribute itself according to what feels perceptible, stable, and narratively fair. But lawful physics keeps producing a universe that is more crowded where it is harder to see, more active where it feels too early, and more difficult to summarize precisely where the summary would comfort us most. The universe does not reward first impressions. It punishes them with depth. There is a quiet cruelty in that. Not malicious cruelty, structural cruelty. The kind that comes from a reality that never promised to be translated into human-scale terms without loss. We want the world to feel broadly like itself. We want appearance to be an honest sketch of structure. We want darkness to mean not much is there, distance to behave like distance, and beginnings to look simple. Instead, darkness means filtering, Distance means delayed history in a changing geometry. Beginnings mean compressed construction. Everywhere you press, intuition gives way. And once you recognize that pattern, the galaxy count stops being a destination entirely. 2 trillion is not the final revelation. It is a symptom. It tells you that the cosmos has been overfilling our models of visible reality all along, and that our most meaningful scientific advances often come not from seeing some impossibly exotic thing, but from discovering how much ordinary lawful structure had been hidden behind the limitations of access. That is a much more disturbing vision of science than the popular one. Popular imagination still likes discovery to feel theatrical, a dramatic object, a shocking anomaly, a singular revelation. But some of the deepest discoveries are quieter and harsher. They tell us not that the universe contains one spectacular exception, but that our baseline sense of what is there was impoverished from the start. Not because reality was subtle, because we were. And now that Webb has pushed us closer to the first generations of galaxies, another implication begins to gather weight. If even our best current instruments are still negotiating with redshift, faintness, crowding, and model dependence at the edge of the observable universe, then the early cosmos is not simply a historical chapter we're steadily reading from left to right. It is a region where visibility itself is under stress. That stress matters, because at some point, the question stops being how quickly structure formed and becomes something harder. How much of the universe's formative history is, in principle, recoverable from light alone? How far can observation be pushed before information becomes too redshifted, too dim, too entangled with later interpretation to yield a clean account of what was there? In other words, even at the frontier of success, a darker possibility appears. What if the universe is not merely vast beyond intuition? What if its most important stages are only partially imageable at all? That is the next wall. Not a failure of telescopes, not a failure of science, a feature of reality itself. Because every gain in vision has been teaching the same lesson in a different language. The cosmos is not built to coincide with the bandwidth of the beings trying to know it. And if that is true near the beginning, it becomes even more severe at the edge. At the edge, the insult becomes almost pure, because by then the problem is no longer just that galaxies are faint, or distant, or easy to misread. The problem is that reality itself extends beyond the zone where light has had time to place it in contact with us. This is where almost every casual mental picture of the universe fails. We imagine a vast sphere of galaxies, perhaps unimaginably large, but still somehow complete in the imagination, as if the observable universe were basically the universe, only large enough to humble us. But the observable universe is not a container holding all that exists. It is a causal region, a domain defined by successful contact, a volume from which signals have reached us since the hot beginning of cosmic expansion. That is not the same thing as totality. Not remotely. And once you see that clearly, the emotional geometry of the cosmos changes again. The observable boundary is not the outer wall of reality. It is the frontier of our receipts. Everything beyond it is not fantasy, not metaphysics in the lazy sense, not a place we invent because we dislike limits. It is simply whatever lies outside current causal access. If the larger cosmological picture is broadly right, and the evidence strongly suggests that it is, then the universe almost certainly continues beyond what we can observe, perhaps vastly beyond, possibly far beyond anything language like vastly can hold without breaking into theatre. Our ignorance has an edge. Reality probably does not. That line matters because it prevents a very common collapse. People often treat the cosmic horizon as if it were a literal ending, like the black border of an old map. But a horizon is only where visibility stops under present conditions. On Earth, the horizon does not mean the ocean ends. It means your line of sight does. The cosmological version is harsher because no ship can carry you there in time to make it recede. The limit is built into the history of expansion itself. You cannot outrun a causal boundary with impatience. That is one of the coldest truths in science, because it means there are regions of reality that may be fully physical, fully lawful, fully continuous with everything we have learned, and yet not available to observation in the ordinary sense, not because we lack courage or technical imagination, but because the universe does not owe all of itself to our vantage point. There is a specific kind of humiliation in that. Not the humiliation of being wrong, the humiliation of being local. For all our instruments, models, detectors, statistical frameworks, and mathematical reach, we remain a civilization inside one tiny region of a much larger structure, reading reality by whatever photons, relic radiation, gravitational signatures, and dynamical traces happen to make it into contact with our patch. Even the grandest cosmological knowledge is still provincial in location, however universal in law. We do not survey the universe from above, we infer it from within. And this is where the galaxy story deepens into something almost philosophical. Because once the observable universe ceases to feel like the universe and starts to feel like a causally illuminated sample, the number of galaxies inside it becomes emotionally double-edged. Trillions of galaxies are already enough to crush intuitive scale. But then comes the secondary blow. Trillions of galaxies still describe only the part of cosmic reality that has been permitted by time and expansion to become visible from here. The number is enormous. The domain it belongs to may not be final. That does not mean we get to say anything we like about what lies beyond the horizon. Good cosmology is stricter than that. There are boundaries between inference and fantasy, and serious science keeps them intact. We do not know the global shape of the entire universe with complete certainty. We do not know whether space is exactly infinite, merely extremely large, or topologically subtler than simple intuition suggests. Inflationary models, large-scale flatness measurements, and the success of standard cosmology all point toward a universe likely extending far beyond the observable patch, possibly enormously so. But likely is not the same as license to improvise. Scientific honesty gets more valuable, not less, when scale becomes unbearable. And honesty here is still severe enough, because even the cautious version says more than intuition can metabolize. It says that everything human beings have ever seen, every star, every galaxy, every cluster, every filament of large-scale structure, every photon ever caught by eye or mirror or sensor, belongs to a finite observable domain inside a possibly much larger whole. A local sample, a regional disclosure, a partial unveiling, and suddenly the black sky above you becomes stranger than any sensational headline about mind-breaking numbers could ever manage. It is not simply a view into a huge universe. It is a view through the narrow slit of causal history, a window whose shape has been cut by the age of the cosmos, the speed of light, and the expansion of space. It is not a landscape. It is a restricted archive. That phrase is worth holding on to because it unifies almost everything the script has done so far. Darkness looked like emptiness because access was thin. Deep fields shattered empty patches because patience widened access. Old galaxy counts were low because visibility biased the sample. Early universe observations became tense because rapid structure formation pushed against our timing intuitions. And now the horizon itself delivers the final correction. Even perfect seeing inside the observable universe would still not become total seeing. The limit survives success. That is what makes the cosmos feel so psychologically severe. In most human endeavors, improvement carries the fantasy of closure. Better measurement means better mastery. Better instruments mean a fuller world. More precise theory means convergence on a complete picture. Cosmology grants improvement, but not closure. It keeps giving us a deeper account of structure while preserving the fact that structure exceeds account. Reality remains larger than its successful description. And that is not failure, it is the mature form of contact. There is something almost beautiful in that, but only if you let beauty remain cold. The universe is intelligible enough to be modelled, yet not arranged to be globally surrendered to observation. Law without comfort, coherence without intimacy. We can know enough to build a cosmology, enough to trace the growth of structure from primordial fluctuations to galaxies and clusters, enough to estimate populations that vastly exceed direct imaging. But knowing more has not turned reality into something friendlier. It has turned it into something cleaner and less forgiving. The more truthful the picture becomes, the less it resembles the one intuition wanted. And once you are standing there, right at the conceptual edge, the old emotional habit of imagining the night sky as a direct portrait of reality becomes impossible to maintain. A few stars over a black dome, that was never the thing itself. It was always the filtered remnant of an incomparably richer order. Local stars near enough to burn through the dark, distant galaxies too faint for the naked eye, ancient light red-shifted beyond vision, entire populations below detection thresholds, and beyond all of that, regions that have not had time to enter causal exchange with us at all. The sky is not lying. It is withholding by law. That is a crucial difference, because a lie implies betrayal. This is not betrayal. It is simply what reality looks like when it is not built around the needs of the observer. And that may be the deepest pattern of all. Not that the universe is bigger than we thought, not that it contains more galaxies than we once counted, not that the early cosmos became structured faster than our naive imagination expected. The deepest pattern is that every layer of better knowledge removes one more hidden privilege from human perception. We are not central. We are not scale appropriate. We are not causally comprehensive. And we are not looking at a finished display. We are standing inside a local clearing in the dark, reconstructing the forest from whatever light reaches the ground. That image matters because it prepares the return not to the horizon, not to Webb, not to the number alone, but to the original thing that felt so obvious it never seemed worthy of suspicion. The night sky, the same sky that looked empty at the beginning of this descent, the same blackness, the same stars, the same ancient silence. Only now, silence has changed its meaning. And once a silence changes meaning, it never fully becomes innocent again. Because innocence depends on a stable reading. A dark sky once meant lack. A few visible stars meant the universe was sparse enough to be emotionally manageable. Distance meant remoteness, but not estrangement. Silence meant stillness. It was possible to stand under the heavens and feel small without feeling structurally misled. That version is gone now. What replaces it is not despair, not some melodramatic collapse into cosmic pessimism. The truth is more precise than that, and therefore more haunting. The night sky has not become less beautiful. It has become less trustworthy as a summary. It is no longer a panorama of what exists. It is a local translation of what survives contact. That is a much colder kind of beauty. Because now every visible star sits inside a field of absences that are not absences at all. Every dark interval between points becomes charged with all the things that failed the conditions for appearance. Galaxies too faint, too red-shifted, too early, too diffuse, too distant, too causally remote. The blackness is no longer empty stage space. It is compressed emission. What looks quiet is merely filtered. That line is not metaphor. It is the mature form of the entire argument. The cosmos is not withholding spectacle because it is poor in structure. It is withholding spectacle because the rules that govern signal, time, wavelength, and access are harsher than the instincts that first evolved to interpret a sky. And once you let that settle, something subtle changes in the emotional relationship between the human and the universe. For most of history, wonder began with what could be seen. Constellations, planets, the Milky Way arching overhead like a pale river of unresolved stars. Even after modern astronomy tore open those old images, it still remained tempting to imagine science as a progressive brightening of the same basic scene. Better telescopes, richer view, larger panorama. But the deeper truth is less pictorial than that. Science did not simply make the sky fuller. It taught us that fullness is not the same thing as visibility. It taught us that the visible cosmos is only the portion of reality that successfully negotiates every penalty imposed between source and observer. Distance penalizes, expansion penalizes, faintness penalizes, time penalizes, biology penalizes, instruments penalize. And reality does not become unreal just because it fails one of those tests. This is why the galaxy count matters so much more than its headline version suggests. Trillions of galaxies sounds like an upgraded large number, one more step in the familiar ladder of astronomical excess. But what it really tells you is that the universe is densely structured in ways that ordinary seeing systematically edits out. The count is not merely grand, it is accusatory. It says the cosmos was already more populated than our first serious observations allowed us to believe, which means the correction is not just quantitative. It is moral, in the old severe sense of the word, a correction to posture, a correction to confidence, a correction to the habit of treating visibility as authority. That is why the strongest cosmology does not simply enlarge the imagination, it disciplines it. It teaches you to stop asking, "What does the universe look like?" and start asking, "What conditions had to be satisfied for this fragment of the universe to look like anything at all?" Those are profoundly different questions. The first still belongs to the ancient human hope that reality will present itself as a scene. The second belongs to a harsher modern maturity. It admits that what appears is only the residue of a long chain of lawful selection. By the time a distant galaxy reaches us, it has already passed through cosmic expansion, redshift, fading, instrumental interpretation, and model-dependent reconstruction. By the time the night sky reaches the naked eye, almost everything has already been excluded. The visible universe is not a gallery. It is a survivor list, and that changes the weight of even the most familiar sights. The stars overhead are no longer just nearby lamps in a dark surrounding. They are members of an extremely biased sample, stars close enough and bright enough to cross into naked eye relevance from one tiny platform on the surface of one planet. The Milky Way is no longer just a beautiful band. It is the inside view of one galactic structure among trillions, seen from within the dust, gas, and local crowding that shaped the very history of human sky perception. Even the deepest telescope images stop being simple pictures and become more like negotiated recoveries from a universe that does not prioritize presentation. This is where cosmology begins to touch something almost existential. Because the real threat to intuition was never just size. Size can still be romanticized. People hear billions or trillions, feel a brief pleasant vertigo, and move on. The deeper wound comes from the discovery that reality is not proportional to our mode of access. The universe is not merely huge. It is huge in a way that guarantees most of its structure will never become naturally available to unaided perception, and not even fully to aided perception. We do not fail to see the universe because we are temporarily unlucky. We fail because seeing was never designed to equal reality. That is the true broken illusion. Not that the cosmos is bigger than it looks. That what looks like a faithful glimpse was ever a faithful category in the first place. Once you cross that line, the oldest human act in astronomy, looking up, becomes philosophically unstable. The gesture remains the same. The biological event remains the same. Photons strike the eye. The dome of night opens overhead. But the meaning has changed irreversibly. Looking up is no longer contact with a visible whole. It is contact with a local, delayed, wavelength-restricted sample, extracted from a much richer and less intuitive order. The same stars, a different contract. And that new contract makes even comfort feel provisional. Because when the sky is black, you now know blackness is not an elementary fact. It is the appearance produced when most of reality lies outside immediate access. When a patch of sky looks empty, you know emptiness may only mean your threshold has not been crossed. When the early universe seems as though it should be quiet, you know that silence may simply reflect poor access to a period of rapid construction. When a galaxy count feels final, you know finality is often just where measurement has not yet been forced hard enough. Everywhere you once saw closure, cosmology inserts condition. That may be the most adult kind of awe, not the loud awe of spectacle, but the disciplined awe that comes from realizing the universe is lawful, coherent, and still under no pressure to present itself in a psychologically accommodating form. It can be elegant without being intimate. It can be intelligible without being available. It can allow deep knowledge while denying total view. Law without reassurance? That is the emotional residue this subject deserves, because anything softer risks lying again. It risks turning the cosmos back into a friendly panorama, a grand visual show staged for admiring minds. But the strongest science says otherwise. It says we are provincial observers inside a reality that remains structured far beyond what it permits us to directly witness. It says our best images are triumphs, but also evidence of how much effort it takes to recover even a partial account. It says the dark between stars is not a neutral canvas. It is the signature of missing access. The night sky did not become poorer under analysis. It became denser, stranger, and less forgiving. And that means the story is now almost ready to turn one last time. Because once the sky stops being a landscape and becomes a limit, the final question is no longer how many galaxies there are, or how many remain unseen, or how far the observable horizon extends. The final question is harder. What does it do to a mind to realize that reality is not built to arrive whole? Because that is the last threshold in this descent. Not astronomy as inventory, but astronomy as a revision of the terms on which the world can be known at all. Because knowing is one of the words this subject quietly breaks. We use it as though it names a stable achievement. You know a place because you can go there. You know an object because you can hold it, turn it, test it from multiple angles. You know a road because you have walked it often enough that its turns no longer surprise you. Even abstraction, in ordinary life, usually remains tied to the fantasy of eventual contact. If necessary, you could check. Cosmology removes that safety net. It gives you truths that are robust, predictive, mathematically disciplined, and still permanently severed from the kind of directness human beings instinctively associate with reality. You can know the age of the universe to remarkable precision. You can map the cosmic microwave background across the sky. You can reconstruct the large-scale distribution of galaxies, measure expansion, infer dark matter halos, estimate star formation histories, model ionization, constrain the geometry of space on immense scales. And yet none of that returns you to something simple like possession. It does not give you the universe in the hand. It gives you a lawful account assembled from surviving contact. That difference becomes almost unbearable once you realize how much science depends on disciplined humility toward what the data can and cannot say. Every honest cosmological claim is built inside layers of mediation. Light had to arrive, detectors had to catch it, noise had to be removed, wavelengths had to be interpreted, distances had to be inferred, models had to translate signatures into histories, alternative explanations had to be weighed, uncertainties had to be carried rather than theatrically erased. This is what separates real contact from storytelling about contact. The universe does not come to us as revelation. It comes to us as evidence. And evidence is a colder form of intimacy. That sentence matters because it forces one final correction to the popular image of scientific triumph. The fantasy version says that science keeps turning darkness into certainty, mystery into possession, the unknown into the known. But the mature version is harder and more beautiful. Science turns confusion into constraint. It turns appearance into recoverable structure. It teaches us which questions can be answered, which can only be bounded, and which remain outside present reach not because we are lazy, but because reality imposes terms. In that sense, the deepest lesson of the Galaxy story is not excess. It is discipline. The night sky looked empty. Science did not merely replace that with a bigger number. It built a chain of reasoning strong enough to show why the appearance misled us, how the miscount happened, where visibility failed, what deep surveys repaired, how the early universe complicated the picture, and why even our best horizon remains a local one. That is not spectacle. That is intellectual character under pressure. And the pressure never really lifts. Because every improvement in contact produces a more exact version of the same uncomfortable truth. The universe is available to understanding in ways it is not available to intuition. That distinction sounds academic until you feel it in the body. Understanding can expand while perceptual comfort shrinks. The map can improve while the world itself becomes less scene-like, less present, less arranged around any form of natural witness. You begin with stars over darkness. You end with a causally restricted sample of a reality whose structure exceeds its appearance at every major scale. That is not just more information. It is a change in what the word world is allowed to mean. For most of our species' history, the world was whatever confronted us directly enough to matter. Ground underfoot, weather overhead, fire, hunger, river, season, tribe, even the sky, for all its distance, still belonged emotionally to that order. It was looked at, named, patterned into constellations, folded into calendars and myth. It was part of the human scene. Modern cosmology has not merely enlarged that scene. It has demoted it. The human scene is local, stunning, fragile, meaningful, yes, but local. The visible stars are local. The Milky Way band is local. Even the observable universe, vast beyond any native sense of scale, is still local relative to whatever larger totality may continue beyond causal access. Reality did not expand around us. Our jurisdiction collapsed inside it. That is why galaxy counts have such a strange emotional power when they are handled honestly. A number like 2 trillion does more than overwhelm. It removes one more hidden assumption that reality should arrive in roughly human-readable proportions. It says no. Even the part you can, in principle, observe contains far more structure than early vision admitted. And the rest of the chain says more. Much of that structure is faint, ancient, redshifted, statistically recovered, or horizon-bound. Reality is not simply bigger than the eye. It is built on scales where the eye ceases to be the right metaphor. Once that becomes clear, another old habit starts to die, the habit of imagining science as something that eventually dissolves mystery. In truth, the best science often changes the species of mystery rather than eliminating it. The crude mystery of ignorance gives way to a sharper one, not what is out there, in the childish sense, but what are the lawful limits under which out-there-ness can become knowable from here? That is a much more adult question, and it has no soft answer, because from here matters, it always mattered. We are not nowhere, we are not outside the experiment, we are on one planet, around one star, in one galaxy, inside one epoch of cosmic history, reconstructing a reality that does not pause for our convenience. Our measurements are extraordinary precisely because they begin from such a provincial platform. But provincial does not mean worthless. It means situated. We know from somewhere. That may be the deepest dignity science offers. Not transcendence of location, but rigor from within it. We do not become gods looking down on the total universe. We remain finite observers building reliable knowledge under severe constraints. The achievement is not that we escaped our position. The achievement is that from within such narrowness, we learn to detect expansion, infer ancient galaxy populations, trace the growth of structure, and recognize that darkness itself is not what we once thought it was. The achievement is not omniscience. It is honest reach. And honest reach leaves a particular aftertaste. Not triumph exactly, not despair, something cleaner, a kind of severe gratitude that reality is intelligible at all, paired with the recognition that intelligibility is not the same thing as full disclosure. The universe permits contact without surrender. It allows model, inference, and reconstruction, while keeping enough distance to prevent comfort from masquerading as comprehension. That is why the script could never really be about a number alone. Numbers numb too easily, they can be admired, repeated, and forgotten. But a broken intuition lingers. A revised relationship to reality lingers. Once you understand that the black sky is not evidence of absence, that deep emptiness is often threshold rather than void, that early structure formed under startling compression, that most galaxies may sit beyond direct visibility, and that even the observable universe is only a local archive of contact, then the old sky never fully comes back. You can still love it. You just cannot misread it in the same innocent way. The stars return. The same stars. Constellations still hold their shapes. Winter air still sharpens their light. The Milky Way still spills its pale dusting across the darkness on clear nights far from the cities. Nothing visible has changed. And yet the scene is no longer what it seemed. Now you know that every point of light is surrounded by lawful emission, that the black between stars is loaded with unseen structure, delayed radiation, inaccessible populations, and regions whose existence is not cancelled by your inability to receive them. You know that a sky can look sparse while reality is crowded, look still while history is arriving, look finite while structure almost certainly continues beyond the horizon of present exchange. The sky did not change. Your contract with appearance did. And maybe that is the final gift hidden inside this subject. Not comfort, not mastery. Something rarer. A way of standing under reality without demanding that it shrink to fit the mind that contemplates it. A way of accepting that the universe is lawful enough to be known, inaccessible enough to remain severe, and beautiful precisely because it never agreed to become merely visible. The night above you is not the face of emptiness. It is what abundance looks like after distance, time, and limit have done their work. And once you understand that, Webb stops being just a telescope. It becomes a moral instrument. Not moral in the sentimental sense, not a machine that teaches virtue, moral in the older, harder sense. It corrects posture. It forces the mind to stand differently in front of reality. Because every time a new observatory opens a deeper band of the universe, the same humiliation returns in a more refined form. What looked sparse becomes populated. What looked final becomes provisional. What looked like a completed picture reveals itself to have been drawn from the bright, nearby, and forgiving fraction. This is not a flaw in science. It is what science feels like when reality is larger than the channel through which you meet it. That is why each observational leap has a strangely double effect. It feels empowering because our reach increases, but it also feels chastening because the increase reveals how narrow the previous reach had been. Hubble did that. The deep fields did that. The revision from hundreds of billions of galaxies to at least around trillions did that. And Webb, in its own way, does it again. Because Webb did not simply give us better pictures of old ideas, it changed the pressure of the beginning. The early universe had long existed as a domain of theory supported by fragments of observation. We knew enough to tell a powerful story: hot dense origin, primordial fluctuations, dark matter scaffolding, gas collapse, first stars, galaxy assembly, rayonization. But a framework is one thing, a witness tempo is another. There is a profound psychological difference between saying structure should emerge rapidly enough under the laws we know and actually detecting luminous systems crowding into epochs once imagined, emotionally at least, as thinner and more incomplete. That is what Webb sharpened. It did not hand us a universe where everything was wrong. That headline was always too adolescent for the evidence. The mature truth is more demanding. Our broad cosmological framework remains astonishingly successful. But within that framework, the first acts of visible structure formation look harsher, faster, and more crowded than naive imagination had any right to expect. Some of the earlier spectacular claims have been softened by better spectroscopy, better stellar population modelling, and the recognition that active black holes can contaminate simple mass estimates. Fine. Good. That is science behaving with adult restraint. But after the restraint, the pressure remains. That matters because it means the discomfort cannot be dismissed as an artifact of hype. Strip away the loud headlines, and the deeper point survives. The young universe was not a quiet waiting room before reality became architecturally serious. Matter began organizing itself into visible systems under immense compression. Light did not wait politely. Structure began early enough, and forcefully enough, to make the first billion years feel less like a prologue and more like a furnace already shaping the rest of cosmic history. This is where the subject becomes almost unbearable in its cumulative effect. Because the same pattern keeps reappearing in different disguises. The black sky misled us. Deep fields corrected the illusion. Galaxy counts rose because faint populations mattered more than the visible sample admitted. The earliest epochs turned out not to be emotionally empty. Again and again. The deeper truth was not reality is stranger than fiction, in some cheap slogan sense. It was something more exacting. Lawful reality is repeatedly less intuitive, less visually generous, and less proportioned to human-scale expectation than our first contact with it suggests. The universe is not bizarre because it breaks its own rules. It is bizarre because it obeys them without regard for ours. That is the difference between serious awe and decorative awe. Decorative awe stops at the number, the image, the headline. Serious awe survives contact with the mechanism. It looks at redshift, causality, expansion, detector thresholds, merger histories, the faint end slope of galaxy populations, the spectral ambiguity of extreme distance sources, and instead of becoming less affected, becomes more affected. Because the mechanism is where the severity lives, not in an inflated adjective, but in the fact that the laws themselves generate a universe that remains coherent while undermining intuition at every layer. And that is why cosmology, at its best, does not simply enlarge knowledge. It trains a new kind of honesty, an honesty about what appearance can do, an honesty about what inference must do, an honesty about where evidence ends and speculation begins, an honesty about how much reality may remain real while unavailable to direct witness. That last one is especially hard for the modern mind because we still carry an old appetite for total disclosure. We want the universe to feel, in principle, completely exposable if only we build the right instrument. But every frontier teaches restraint. Better instruments do not abolish limitation. They relocate it, push into the infrared, and the earliest galaxies emerge more clearly, but with new ambiguities about interpretation. Push the census deeper, and hidden populations reveal themselves, while implying still larger unseen populations beneath previous thresholds, clarify the observable universe, and the horizon itself becomes more philosophically severe, because the clearer it is, the more sharply it distinguishes local disclosure from total reality. Success does not erase the limit, it outlines it. That may be one of the most beautiful sentences science can produce, provided beauty is allowed to remain cold, because it means knowledge is not a march toward making reality small enough to own. It is a process of refining contact with something that remains larger than contact. The map improves, the terrain does not shrink, the equations tighten, the horizon does not apologize. And from that position, the galaxy count takes on its final weight, not as a trivia fact, not as a spectacle number, as a compression of the entire argument, at least trillions of galaxies in the observable universe, most of them historically or currently difficult to detect directly. Many of them belonging to faint populations, our earliest confident pictures barely included. That statement is not impressive merely because it is large. It is impressive because it contains within it a history of corrected arrogance. We thought the visible sample was close to the world. It was not. We thought darkness was mostly lack. It was not. We thought the early cosmos would feel sparser. Not enough. We thought better seeing would mean a more complete scene. Instead, it meant more exact awareness of incompleteness. That repetition is not redundancy. It is convergence. Different lines of evidence, different generations of instruments, different scales of analysis, all collapsing into the same adult realization. Reality is not made to arrive whole. Not to eyes, not to cameras, not even to theory in any final possessive sense. It arrives in fragments lawful enough to reconstruct from, but not arranged for comfort. That is the hidden architecture beneath the title of this video. Not just there are trillions of galaxies, not even the observable universe is vastly richer than it looks. The deeper truth is that the universe breaks the brain only after it first breaks a more primitive thing. The assumption that visibility is a trustworthy guide to existence. Once that assumption dies, the rest follows with a kind of quiet inevitability. Of course, the sky can look empty while reality is full. Of course, the beginning can look sparse while structure is already erupting under pressure. Of course, the edge of observation can mark not the end of what exists, but the end of what causality is delivered here so far. Of course, a species evolved for local survival would misread a cosmos organized across scales, times, and energies far outside ancestral relevance. The surprise is not that intuition fails. The surprise is how long we expected it not to. And maybe that is the most dignified place to stand now. Not in false mastery, not in theatrical confusion, but in lucid disproportion. To know that the mind is too local for the universe, and yet still capable of building methods that recover pieces of its structure with astonishing fidelity. To know that the sky is not a reliable portrait, and still to look. To know that the horizon is real as a limit of contact, not as a wall around being. To know that even our greatest images are negotiations with loss, and still to trust what disciplined inference can recover from them. That combination, humility without surrender, is where the story becomes fully human. Because what science finally gives us is not the universe reduced to our scale. It gives us ourselves reduced to our true one. And that reduction is not a defeat. It only feels like one if dignity depends on centrality. For most of human history, it did. Not always explicitly, not always theologically, not always with arrogance. But somewhere under the surface there was a durable hope that reality would make some kind of native sense from the place we happened to stand, that the world, however vast, would still in some deep way be proportioned to the witness. That scale might humble us, but not fundamentally disqualify our instincts, that if we looked hard enough, long enough, clearly enough, the universe would eventually begin to resemble the terms in which we first encountered it. But cosmology has been dismantling that hope piece by piece. Not cruelly, not chaotically, with evidence. The Milky Way stopped being the universe, then visible stars stopped being a fair sample, then galaxies multiplied beyond early counts, then dark patches of sky filled with hidden structure, then the beginning of the universe ceased to behave like a sparse overture. Then the observable horizon revealed itself as a local boundary of contact, not a border around what is. At no point did the laws break. At every point, intuition did. That pattern matters because it tells you something larger than astronomy. It tells you what happens when a biological mind, tuned by survival, tries to interpret a lawful reality built on scales survival never needed to see. The mind does not fail because it is stupid. It fails because it was optimized for another regime entirely. A leopard in tall grass matters. A cliff edge matters. The change in weather over a valley matters. Trillions of galaxies hidden behind redshift and faintness do not. Natural selection never needed to prepare you for cosmology. And yet here we are. A species that began by reading tracks in mud ended up building cryogenic detectors, orbiting telescopes, interferometers, spectrographs, and mathematical models strong enough to infer the age, expansion, composition, and deep structure of a universe that never once arranged itself to be intuitively visible. That should feel almost impossible. Not because we conquered reality, because we learned how not to confuse ourselves in front of it. That may be the most underrated achievement in science. Not discovery as accumulation, but discovery as disciplined refusal. Refusal to trust what appears merely obvious. Refusal to accept the visible sample as final. Refusal to let the blackness of the sky dictate the ontology of the cosmos. Refusal to treat a bright minority as the whole population. Refusal to mistake causal horizons for endings. Every major advance in this story was, at bottom, an act of resistance against convenience. Convenience said the night sky looked mostly empty. Convenience said the Milky Way was the whole arena. Convenience said the bright galaxies were the main inventory. Convenience said the early universe should feel visually thin. Convenience said the observable was close enough to the total to soothe the imagination. Science kept saying no, and that repeated no is what gives the subject its strange emotional force, because each correction is more than a fact. It is a broken habit of mind, a habit that once felt natural, then revealed itself to be provincial. There is something almost severe in that word, provincial. It means not merely small, but local while imagining itself general. That is what our first cosmic intuitions were. Provincial judgments delivered with universal confidence. Darkness means little is there. What is bright is what matters. The beginning must be simple in the way stories like beginnings to be simple. The edge of sight must be close to the edge of reality. Provincial, every one of them. And yet the answer is not self-contempt. That would be another form of vanity. The answer is proportion. To recognize that the mind's first reading of the universe was never going to be enough, and that the dignity of science lies not in confirming human-scale common sense, but in building methods capable of transcending it without pretending to become godlike. We remain situated. That has not changed. We still observe from one world around one star inside one galaxy. We still receive ancient photons under narrow physical conditions. We still model from partial access. We still infer more than we directly see. We still do cosmology from inside the event, never outside it. All of that remains true. But within those constraints, something extraordinary happened. We learned to trust disciplined indirectness more than raw immediacy. That is a civilization-level turning point. Because indirectness sounds weak until you understand what it can do. No one has stepped outside the universe to photograph it whole. No one has flown beyond the cosmic horizon and looked back. No one has watched galaxy formation in real time from beginning to end. And yet through redshift, background radiation, stellar spectra, gravitational dynamics, deep surveys, number counts, and the patient logic of inference, we have reconstructed enough of the cosmic story to know that the visible night is a distortion by omission. Not a fantasy, not a lie, a distortion. And that makes the night sky more interesting than any romantic version of it ever was. The old romance depended on the stars as presences, bright points puncturing darkness, each one a beacon, each one enough to trigger wonder on its own. That feeling is still real, it still deserves to survive, but now it survives inside a harsher framework. The stars are not isolated ornaments suspended in a mostly vacant void. They are the nearest readable points in a reality saturated with unread or partially read structure. The darkness between them is not dead space. It is what lawful inaccessibility looks like when rendered to a local eye. Even silence changes under that pressure. Silence used to imply stillness, a kind of cosmic hush. But now the hush is exposed to selective hearing. Out there, Stars are igniting, collapsing, merging, detonating, galaxies are interacting, black holes are accreting, radiation is crossing expanding space. Structures are evolving over timescales that mock the nervous system but not the equations. The universe is not quiet in the human sense. We are quiet relative to what we fail to receive. That is one of the final humiliations in the story, and one of the most beautiful, because it means the cosmos does not need to become dramatic by violating its own laws. The laws already generate more than enough grandeur, expansion, causality, radiative transfer, gravitational collapse, merger history, horizon structure. None of these are theatrical devices. They are mechanisms, and yet, taken together, they produce a reality so much richer than appearance that even honesty begins to feel uncanny. That is the level this subject belongs on. Not mind-blowing fact, not recycled ore, not decorative bigness. A lawful universe whose deepest insult to human intuition is not that it is chaotic, but that it is coherent in ways we were never built to naturally apprehend. And once you feel that fully, another old fantasy falls away, the fantasy that science eventually removes wonder by replacing mystery with explanation. Explanation does remove one kind of mystery, the cheap kind built from ignorance alone, but it often replaces it with something stronger, a sharpened wonder grounded in mechanism, the mature recognition that reality can become more intelligible and less domesticated at the same time. That is exactly what happened here. We explained why the sky is dark. We explained why empty patches are not empty. We explained why galaxy counts rose. We explained why the early universe looks so pressured. We explained why the observable universe is not the whole universe. And the result is not a smaller cosmos. It is a colder one, a clearer one, a less forgiving one, which is why the emotional residue cannot be mere awe. Awe is too broad, too easily sentimental. What remains after this subject is narrower and sharper, something like haunted clarity, the sense that reality has become more visible in meaning while remaining less visible in form, the sense that what looked like absence has been permanently stripped of innocence, the sense that blackness itself now carries structure in silence. Once you have that, the return becomes unavoidable. You have to go back to the beginning, back to the first image, back to the oldest human act in astronomy. You have to look up again, and this time the sky will not be allowed to mean what it meant before. Look up again, and nothing visible has changed. That is what makes the transformation so severe. The same stars are there, the same dark intervals, the same cold spread of night that once felt so naturally self-explanatory you could stand beneath it without suspecting that almost every first impression it gave you was structurally incomplete. The eye still receives points of light against blackness. The nervous system still translates that into distance, calm, sparsity. The ancient animal inside the modern observer still wants to accept the scene at face value. But face value is what this whole descent destroyed. Now, when you look into a dark region of sky, you do not see nothing. You see a threshold you cannot personally cross. You see the consequence of finite age, cosmic expansion, wavelength shift, fading brightness, instrumental limitation, and local biology all compressing a richer reality into an austere visual surface. The blackness no longer reads as emptiness. It reads as a deficit of access. That is a hard sentence to truly absorb, because it changes not just what the sky means, but what seeing means. Seeing once felt like a kind of direct transaction. Light arrives, the world presents itself, perception receives, imperfectly. Yes, but honestly enough for practical trust. Cosmology does not fully abolish that trust. It does something stranger. It reveals that at the larger scales, seeing is not a transaction with presence so much as a negotiation with survivorship. What reaches you has already endured time, expansion, redshift, attenuation, and every other physical condition that decides whether a signal becomes available at all. The visible universe is what made it through. That is not the same thing as the universe. And once you know that, the night sky becomes almost unbearable in its restraint. Not because it is ugly, not because it is disappointing, because it is so visually calm while hiding so much lawful excess. Trillions of galaxies in the observable universe. Most historically difficult or impossible to directly detect with earlier instruments. ancient structures building themselves under compressed conditions, a cosmic horizon beyond which reality may continue without becoming available here. All of that, and still the eye receives a black field with sparse interruptions. No better symbol exists for the mismatch between perception and structure. The sky is not deceptive in the moral sense. It is parsimonious in the physical one. That distinction matters because it protects the science from turning into melodrama. The universe is not playing games. It is not hiding things out of theatrical cruelty. It is simply built in such a way that disclosure is conditional. Information arrives under rules. Many structures fail those rules from where we happen to stand. Many others arrive only after being transformed almost beyond intuitive recognition. Still others may never enter contact at all, not because they are unreal, but because causality has not delivered them here. Reality is larger than reception. That is the mature form of the whole script. On the surface, this was a story about galaxies, about the absurdity of their numbers, the revisions to our counts, the discoveries of deep surveys and Webb, the strange violence of the early universe, and the horizon that confines what can be seen. But underneath all of it, one argument kept tightening until it became impossible to avoid. Human intuition was never built to interpret reality at cosmic scale. Not simply because the universe is large, because the universe is lawful in ways that systematically punish first impressions. Darkness suggests lack. Law says finite age, redshift, and threshold. Brightness suggests importance. Law says observational bias. Distance suggests static separation. Law says evolving geometry. Beginning suggests simplicity. Law says compressed structure formation. Visibility suggests existence. Law says visibility is filtered survival. At every step, the naive version lost. And that is why the final realization is not just that there are more galaxies than we used to think. It is that the cosmos repeatedly becomes less intuitive as it becomes more accurate. Deeper knowledge does not restore psychological comfort. It removes it. It replaces scenic understanding with structural understanding. It replaces the visible world with a rigorously reconstructed one. It teaches you, over and over, that what feels fundamental is often just what your mode of access happens to privilege. That is a brutal education. It is also one of the highest forms of honesty human beings have ever achieved. Because the temptation to lie here is overwhelming, to turn the universe into a grand visual drama staged for our wonder, to make the sky feel like a direct portrait of reality, to flatten uncertainty into slogans and complexity into spectacle, to say trillions of galaxies and let the number do all the work. But the truth is harder and better than that. The truth is that the number only matters because of what it reveals about our failures of access. The truth is that astronomy becomes deepest precisely where it stops giving you a scene and starts giving you constraints. A scene can be admired. A constraint can change the way you think. And that is what has happened by now. The sky has ceased to be a backdrop. It has become evidence, evidence of delay, evidence of filtering, evidence of causal limit, evidence that reality can be densely structured while almost refusing to look like itself to a naked local witness. The stars are still there, yes, but now they sit inside a transformed silence. It is no longer the old silence of presumed emptiness. It is the silence that remains after most of reality has fallen outside the channel of appearance. The silence of omitted wavelengths. The silence of ancient photons still travelling. The silence of galaxies too faint to resolve. The silence of early structures glimpsed only by instruments that must translate invisible radiation into human form. The silence of regions beyond the observable horizon, physically possible, perhaps inevitable, and still not ours to witness. That silence is not peace. It is limit made visible. And once you feel that, you understand why this subject lingers so differently from ordinary science content. It does not merely inform, it revises posture. It changes how the mind stands in front of the real. You're no longer the observer of a vast scene. You are the beneficiary of a narrow causal opening into a reality that exceeds the opening at every scale. That sounds diminishing. It is. But it is also liberating in a severe way. Because once reality no longer has to resemble your intuition, you stop asking it to. You stop demanding that darkness mean emptiness, that visibility mean completeness, that beginnings feel emotionally fair, that horizons act like walls, That explanation collapsed strangeness into comfort. You let the universe remain what it is, coherent, lawful, uncentered, and under no obligation to become psychologically legible. And that is where the real awe begins. Not the decorative awe of giant numbers, not the temporary awe of dramatic images. The harder awe that comes from realizing that the world is intelligible without being domesticated, that it can be known without being possessed, that it can be mapped in part while remaining fundamentally larger than the channels through which the map is built, that it can allow contact without surrendering itself to appearance. There is a kind of tragic beauty in that arrangement. We are small, local, late, and constrained. We see almost nothing directly. Even our greatest achievements are inferences drawn from weakened traces. And yet from that position, from one planet around one star in one galaxy among trillions, we have still learned enough to know that the black sky is not what it seems. That may be the most human thing in this entire story. Not that we mastered the cosmos, that we learned how not to mistake our own limits for its shape. So when you look up now, the old sky is gone. Even though it remains physically unchanged, the constellations persist, the stars persist, the darkness persists, but the meaning has been permanently altered. The darkness is no longer absence, it is compression. The silence is no longer emptiness, it is censored abundance. The night is no longer a picture of the universe. It is what the universe looks like after distance, time, law, and limitation have stripped most of themselves away before reaching you. And perhaps that is the final truth hidden inside the title. The truth about trillions of galaxies does not break your brain because the number is too big. It breaks your brain because it reveals that reality was never obliged to look anything like the fraction of it you were born able to see. And once that becomes unavoidable, the number itself almost disappears. Not because it stops mattering, because it has already done its work. Trillions of galaxies. Say it enough times and the phrase risks becoming decorative. Another oversized fact polished smooth by repetition. The human mind has a way of protecting itself from unbearable scale by turning it into rhythm. Billion, trillion, observable universe, horizon, expansion. After a while, the terms begin to sound familiar, and familiarity is dangerous. It creates the illusion that comprehension has arrived just because language has settled into place. But comprehension is not the same as verbal comfort. The true force of this subject was never numerical. It was structural. The galaxy count mattered because it exposed a pattern. The pattern mattered because it exposed a limit, and the limit mattered because it changed the relationship between observer and reality itself. That is the final descent. Not into bigger numbers, but into a harsher idea of truth. A truth that does not mean seeing everything. A truth that does not mean standing outside the cosmos. A truth that does not mean turning the universe into a completed picture. A truth that means learning how to read a world that arrives damaged by distance, delayed by time, thinned by expansion, filtered by wavelength, censored by threshold, and still somehow coherent enough to yield itself in part. That is not the truth of possession. It is the truth of asymptotic contact. You never quite touch the whole thing. You move toward better and better forms of disciplined relation. There is something almost severe in the beauty of that, because it means science does not rescue us from finitude. It teaches us how to think inside it. It shows us how to work from incompleteness without collapsing into fantasy, how to infer without hallucinating, how to accept that some things are hidden by law and not by malice, and how to let reality remain larger than the methods by which it becomes legible. That is a very different kind of grandeur from the one people usually come to astronomy looking for. Most people think they want size. They think they want vastness, visual spectacle, a clean rush of insignificance. They want the emotional drop of hearing that there are more galaxies than grains of sand, more stars than thoughts, more distance than metaphor can hold. And for a moment, that works. For a moment, scale alone is enough to produce vertigo. But scale by itself is shallow. It overwhelms, then it passes. What remains is not size. What remains is revision. The revision that darkness is not a neutral condition. The revision that visibility is not authority. The revision that the observable is not the total. The revision that the beginning of the universe was not emotionally sparse. The revision that the eye was never the right model for cosmic truth. These are the things that stay because they do not merely enlarge the universe. They alter the rules by which a human mind is allowed to believe in a universe at all. And that is why this subject leaves such a strange residue. Not hopelessness, not romance, something cleaner, almost harder to name. You could call it humility, but that word is often made too soft. You could call it awe, but awe is too broad and too easily sentimental. What remains here is more exacting than both, a kind of lucid estrangement, a realization that reality is lawful enough to be known, and still under no pressure to feel native to the creature trying to know it. That is the atmosphere the night sky now carries. Not mystery in the cheap sense, not blankness waiting for imagination, austere evidence. A black surface underwritten by impossible abundance, every familiar point of light suspended inside a field of lawful emission, every dark interval carrying the weight of what failed to arrive in visible form, every clear night an encounter not with a faithful portrait, but with a radically edited disclosure. Even the word sky begins to feel too small for what is happening, because a sky sounds like a dome, a ceiling, a visible surround, something offered intact to the witness. But what hangs above you at night is not intact in that way. It is a local rendering of an incomparably larger structure, stripped down by circumstance until it can pass through the narrow gate of human perception. To call it a sky is not wrong. It is just no longer enough. And maybe that is the deepest shift of all, the discovery that ordinary words remain usable but not innocent. Star, dark, distance, empty, beginning, horizon, each of them survives. Each of them still points to something real. But after modern cosmology, none of them mean what they once seemed to mean on first contact. They have all been forced through correction. They now carry mechanism inside them, history inside them, limitation inside them. Language itself comes back heavier, which is fitting, because the whole story has really been about weight. Not just the weight of galaxies, or the weight of numbers, but the weight of implication. How much must change once you admit that most of reality does not naturally arrive to you as itself? How much of the old world picture collapses once the black sky is no longer allowed to function as evidence of absence? How much philosophical comfort has to be surrendered once even the observable universe turns out to be only a regional disclosure inside a larger unknown? The answer is almost all of it. What you get back is truer, but less intimate. And yet that loss is not sterile. It does not drain the world of meaning. In a strange way, it deepens meaning by removing projection. The universe no longer has to pretend to be staged for us. It no longer has to mirror the proportions of our instincts. It can be what it is, a lawful order of staggering richness, partially available, permanently excessive, beautiful without accommodation. That phrase matters. Beautiful without accommodation. Because it names the exact tone this subject deserves. Not the beauty of a world arranged to console, not the beauty of a story smoothed to fit the appetite for wonder, the beauty of something more severe, a reality that exceeds perception and remains coherent anyway, a reality whose structure can be recovered piece by piece without ever becoming psychologically tame, a reality that grants understanding while denying the old dream that understanding would make it feel like home. Perhaps that is why cosmology feels, at its best, almost philosophical against its will. It begins in measurement and ends in posture. It begins in detectors and ends in humility. It begins with photons and concludes by changing the terms on which appearance itself can be trusted. Not because science abandoned rigour, but because rigour carried it there. And now there's only one thing left to do. Not to add another discovery, not to widen the census one more time, not to chase one more spectacular image across the frontier, only to return to the first human fact in the whole story. A person standing under the night sky. A body on a small planet, a local mind, a pair of eyes, darkness overhead. The scene could not be more ancient. The understanding could not be more changed. You look up, and the stars still seem sparse enough to count in clusters. The black between them still looks calm enough to call empty. The whole arrangement still tempts the old reading, that reality is mostly vacancy, lightly decorated by islands of light. But you know now that this is only what abundance looks like after nearly everything has been removed from view. You know that the darkness is loaded. You know that the silence is selective. You know that the visible is a survivor fraction. You know that the count of galaxies was never just a count. It was a warning about the poverty of first impressions. And once a warning like that is fully heard, the world never quite returns to its earlier scale. The sky remains above you, but the innocence is gone. But what replaces innocence is not emptiness. It is something far more difficult to live with and far more worthy of reality. A final kind of clarity. Not the clarity of completion, not the comfort of feeling that the universe has at last been gathered into one finished picture. That was never available. The deeper the science became, the less available it became. Every step forward stripped away one more false simplification. The sky was not empty. The visible was not the whole. The horizon was not an edge. The beginning was not quiet. The count was not final. The image was not the thing itself. And yet from all those losses something cleaner emerged. A mind more proportionate to what it faces. That may be the true destination of this story. Not a revelation about galaxies alone, but a correction in scale between the observer and the real. The numbers mattered because they broke the old emotional geometry. Trillions of galaxies did not just enlarge the cosmos. They made it impossible to keep pretending that visibility and existence belonged to the same category. They forced the deeper realization that what appears is not reality in miniature. It is reality after passage, after delay, after stretching, after attenuation, after all the penalties imposed between what is and what can arrive here. The night sky is not a portrait. It is a remainder. That word should stay with you, because it contains almost everything. A remainder is what survives subtraction. What stays after distance takes its cut, after time takes its cut, after redshift takes its cut, after causality takes its cut, after detectors and biology and wavelength windows take theirs. And still, after all that subtraction, enough remains for us to know that the subtraction happened. That is the miracle, if the word is allowed to remain disciplined. Not that the universe made itself easy to see, that from within such brutal limitation, truth was still recoverable. Recoverable, but never ownable. This is the last distinction worth keeping intact. The modern mind often confuses knowledge with conquest. To know something, in that instinct, is to dominate it conceptually, to reduce it to a stable object in the grasp. But cosmology does not offer that kind of knowledge. It offers something older, sterner, and in a way more honest. Orientation without possession, reliable relation without total view, understanding strong enough to transform you, but not soft enough to make reality feel domesticated. The universe allows contact. It does not yield intimacy on human terms. And perhaps that is why the strongest response to this subject is not triumph, not despair, not even ordinary awe. It is reverence without illusion. A willingness to stand under the sky and accept that what looks like silence is only the part of reality that could survive becoming audible here. That what looks like darkness is only the part of abundance left after almost all abundance has fallen outside direct sight. That what looks like a stable scene is actually an arriving archive of different times, different distances, different conditions of access, all compressed into one local experience. You're not looking at the universe as it is. You're looking at what the universe permits, from here. That sentence is not a defeat. It is a liberation from a childish contract we never should have trusted. The contract that reality must feel legible to count as real. The contract that the visible world is the true world with only minor corrections. The contract that if we stared long enough, the cosmos would eventually offer itself as a coherent scene sized for human awe. It never was going to do that. It gave us something better and less comforting instead. A lawful order so vast, so layered, and so indifferent to intuitive proportion, that every honest improvement in knowledge deepened the same lesson. Reality is not built to match the scale of the mind encountering it. And yet the mind, through discipline, patience, mathematics, and instruments of extraordinary delicacy, can still touch fragments of that order well enough to be changed by them. That is the human victory here. Not that we made the universe smaller, that we learned how to remain truthful while standing inside something that would never become small enough. So return one last time to the oldest image in the whole story. A human being outside at night, air cooling on the skin, silence settling across the ground, a few stars holding their places above the dark, nothing in the visible scene announcing the true scale of what is there. And yet now the scene has become almost unbearably dense. Because you know what the darkness contains by not containing. You know what the silence implies by failing to say it. You know that between those stars lie galaxies the eye will never isolate, ancient light it cannot register, hidden populations inferred more cleanly than seen, and beyond all of that, regions that remain physically continuous with reality, while never having entered contact with this one small world. The sky has not become fuller, your reading of it has become less false. And that is the final shift. The truth about trillions of galaxies does not matter because the number is too large to imagine. It matters because it reveals that the universe was never obliged to look remotely like the fraction of itself that reaches us. The black above you is not emptiness, it is evidence. Evidence that reality exceeds appearance. Evidence that law exceeds intuition. Evidence that darkness can be crowded. Evidence that silence can be saturated. Evidence that the visible world, however beautiful, is only the thinnest negotiable layer of a far deeper structure. The sky did not change. Reality did not change. Only the permission to misread it did. And once that permission is gone, you never really look up again. You stand beneath the same stars. But now you know you're standing beneath a censored universe.